That's a two-player swing.
Gee, thanks, Patches. I can't wait to start my own team at school.
Atta boy, Tiger. But remember,
PvP
is a sport of violence, exclusion, and degradation. So, when you're picking players in gym class, remember to pick the bigger, stronger kids for your team. That way, you can all gang up on the weaker ones, like Winston here. Nice one, son. You'll be an all-star yet.
Season 13 has come and gone, and it was probably the worst season ever in Guild Wars 2's history, as I mentioned in my last video. Balance was dreadful, the same fundamental issues that have plagued Ranked from Season 1 were still rampant, the top 0.1% of players basically ran the game, and the promise of any real reward at the end of it all did not exist. Well, I'm happy to say, it's over. And while I can confirm that the game has improved since then, in fixing a lot of the issues that I mentioned in that video, and even in ignoring some of the more unreasonable things I might have said, but overall ranked PvP, or maybe even PvP in general, remains a very meh, unfun, broken, and especially toxic experience. Keep in mind, since a lot of the problems I mentioned in Season 13 have had some fixes, like there actually being some kind of reward for success, a new map after nearly 2 years, 2v2 ATs, and among other issues I may have mentioned, there does exist a lot of the problems from my last video, those being terrible balancing, a fundamentally broken competitive system, and an easily exploitable, unjustifiable DuoQ option in a 5v5 game type, with about maybe 1 to 2,000 people playing it all together. People are leaving. No progress or attention is being given to SPvP, and it's a real shame. Guild Wars 2 PvP, in my opinion, has so much potential to be great, fun, enjoyable, but poor design has held it back again and again, to the point where it's become the Overwatch of MMOs. When I say Overwatch of MMOs, I mean playing it now feels like a chore, something you don't want to do. There's just so many better options like Apex Legends, Smash Ultimate, pretty much anything else that has come out recently or even a long time ago. I would much rather play that than Guild Wars 2 PvP in its current state. Guild Wars 2 PvP has become nothing but an afterthought, not only to the players who play it, but to the developers themselves. But still, I cling to the vague hope that PvP will improve, rather than fading into complete obscurity, where the same handful of players dominate every season, every AT, and often every single match. This video is my last attempt in pointing out some critical flaws in ranked Guild Wars 2 PvP as a system, in an attempt to save what remains. I am sorry to say, but this time around I'm not going to delve much into balance for 2 reasons. One being clear from the first video that I don't really have a very good understanding about balance to begin with. I have pretty controversial views there. And 2 being that if I do talk about balance, then we both know this video is only going to be about balance, even if I only mention it briefly. Really, the only thing I'd want you to take away from that video and this video going forward about balance, in my opinion, is that Guild Wars 2 PvP has been and always will be terrible. There's terrible balancing issues that have held it back, and in my opinion always will hold it back. But this video is not going to be about balance. This is intended to attack the fundamental issues of ranked PvP and DuoQ, especially DuoQ. As such, this video may come off as an attack on the top 1% of players that cling to and depend on DuoQ to farm ranked for profit and success at the expense of the other 99% of players and their enjoyment. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it, that's exactly what it is. It's what they deserve. I'll be taking their counter-arguments directly from the forums. However, for the sake of anonymity, I will do them a service of censoring their usernames where I can for privacy's sake, but I will link all my sources in the description should you want to go and check out these forums threads for yourself or these videos. This video in particular will be split into 2 parts, one being more informative, the other looking at counter-arguments from those responsible for DuoQ. There's a lot to talk about, so without wasting any more time, let's begin. Starting out with a big focal point of my last video, ranked SPvP is just broken, fundamentally, which makes it really hard to enjoy, and even harder to find success in, when it's truly deserved. I think the biggest reason for this is the way points are rewarded, how it's always been, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. This problem used to garner a lot of criticism, especially on the forums, but I feel over time people have just become complacent with this issue, when they really have no reason to be. Any other game wouldn't give out points seemingly at random like this. You can get anywhere from +9 to +18 for a win in Guild Wars 2, but always, regardless of how well you do, your win and loss streaks, and factors beyond your control like win traders, DCs, and idle players, this game will always find a way to deduct more points for a loss than you would gain for a win. And as proven by other games, the solutions are really, really simple. Biggest thing, which I don't think I did a very good job explaining this in my last video, is that it should take your personal performance into account. If you are consistently performing well in your games, getting a high percentage of damage, healing, kills, offensive and defensive assist, caps, decaps, everything, which that can cater to every profession in the game if you think about it. So regardless of what you're playing, the game should be able to recognize how well you're doing, and that should alter how many points you're going to gain or lose at the end. I know in my last video I used top stats as an example. I really don't have an excuse for that. I was just thinking out of my ass, really. Top stats should not be the influence there. Rather, just how well you're doing with your class, regardless of your build. The main takeaway here is your personal performance should dictate how many points you gain or lose. A second point is that win and loss streaks should also be a factor, and that's not to say that they aren't already. In my experience, if you win multiple games in a row, that does tend to get you matched with higher rated players, and it causes you to lose far more points if you don't find success with those players. And like I said in my last video, that's absolutely fine. That's how it should be. But what Guild Wars 2 gets wrong is that it puts you with those higher rated players, it turns the odds against you, yet if you still manage to win and find success with those higher rated players, the point gain has little to no difference to your average win. That, in my opinion, is total crap. If you are on a streak, which is hard enough, trust me, and you're beating higher rated players to boot, you deserve a huge rank gain. We're talking +20 all the way to +30, because that shows that you're playing well outside of your skill level. Likewise, if you were playing below, and you were, say, losing many games in a row, even against lower rated players, then that's a sign that you might not be up to par, or you might be a little bit rusty, you're coming back to the game, so maybe you get -20, -30, bump you down a little bit to an even playing field. But then again, the playing field isn't even, because the matchmaker is broken and needs to be fixed. I'd say now more than ever, the matchmaking in Guild Wars 2 is awful. Actually terrible. People as low as Silver 3 are getting matched with Plats because the population is so low. Factor in DuoQ, which amplifies this problem about 10 times, and is actually kind of unbearable. And not just for lower ranks, for everyone. With no sort of cap on how far apart 2 ranks can queue together when DuoQing, that really breaks the matchmaker. It has to attempt to fill that heavy rank imbalance with a mix of gold and silvers that actually want to play on their level. Not the plat level. They probably want to be there as much as the plats themselves want them there. Even low-level DuoQs essentially throw the games for themselves and their teams, because the matchmaker seems to think that 2 pair golds present a big enough threat to warrant matching them against the very top percent of the player base. And I get it that fixing a problem that comes from the low population isn't easy without increasing the population itself, but a good start would be removing DuoQ, or at the very least increasing their queue times to value getting into a game that's likely to be fair, to be close, rather than getting into a game as quickly as humanly possible. That's for the sake of match quality. Blowout losses and wins aren't very fun for either side, but the likelihood for a game to be fair and even drops drastically when you insert something like 2 top players in a duo stack into a game that has maybe a couple hundred people playing it at any one time of the day. And it's in a 5v5 game mode at that. Final fundamental issue I'll talk about is toxicity in ranked. For a while I was under the illusion that this was getting better, and that ArenaNet was finally starting to crack down on win traders, leavers, and idlers. But with my last few games and the relative silence towards the subject on their end, I'm going to assume it's the same as it's always been, and I was just a bit deluded. Win trading and idling are big issues, bigger than ever, but in ArenaNet's eyes, it's only a big enough issue to warrant a 72-hour at max ban. I think the people doing this, regardless of their influence, deserve PvP bans that can last up to an entire season's length. Similarly, the top pros that are creating alts as well, and duo farming them up to the top of the leaderboards also deserve PvP bans. And in the time since last season, apparently botting is even a thing now, and those definitely need to be banned, not just from ranked, but from the game entirely. I don't have much else to say here. Like, these things should be obvious. ArenaNet needs to crack down on these issues in order to solve them. To close here, I will admit that ArenaNet has made some improvements. For one, they gave us more of an incentive than a stupid potion to actually play ranked. And for two, for the first time in about 2 years, they finally gave us some new content in PvP, and that came in the form of 2v2 ATs and the new map. Say what you want about Dinge, I don't know how you say that, but the Dominion map. It might not be the best map, but 2v2 ATs, you can't argue that they're bad. They were pretty fun. I think if 2v2s become a permanent feature, and we keep on this course of actually getting content, instead of PvP just being a bare, unfair wasteland, then we'll see the population slowly rise as a result. DuoQ was a mistake. It doesn't matter what level you play at, what level you have played at, it holds no real place in a 5v5 game mode with such a low population. The only reason it's here now is because the same people who are abusing it whined endlessly that it was unfair that anyone below 1600 rating could DuoQ. Never minding the fact that DuoQs below that rating were already very rare to begin with, as stated by ArenaNet in their original reasoning for removing it, but as soon as these top players get it, they'll stack with each other and roll across the majority of uncoordinated random golds, low plats, and even silvers like it's perfectly fair. These top players are total hypocrites, exploiting a system to ensure they stay where they'd probably be regardless of whether or not DuoQ existed, at the expense of the majority of players. But I'll delve into it further as I look at some counter-arguments from the other side, presented by those who are pro-DuoQ, and offering some insight as to why, in my opinion, they don't carry any weight. Starting with this, the undoubtedly most common excuse that the top percent will use to justify DuoQ's existence. The old, "I just want to play with friends" excuse. It amazes me that people fall for this, considering it's no more than a victim card. There are countless ways for you to play with your friends that do exist, have existed, or could exist. We're talking ATs, 2v2 ATs, unranked, and team queue. All ways to play with friends, all more fair by design, so one has to ask, why DuoQ? It's a 5v5 game mode. A 5v5 stack in either an AT or team queue is as fair as it can possibly get. Same goes for 2v2, being duos. But in DuoQ'd ranked, you're not playing with your friends. You're playing with one other friend, and you're guaranteed at least one other solo player, and 2 other randoms, regardless of they're in a 2OQ or solo. They're not having the same fun as you. How is that fair? They're not playing with friends. That's not even taking into account the players on the other team. If your 2 top players stacked together, you're gonna roll over them, and they might not have a single DuoQ between them. A sentiment I think people would agree with is that all of the aforementioned game modes should all be permanent. In ranked, you should have the option to either solo or team queue. It needs to be split, because a team mixed with solos is in no way on the same playing field as, say, a full 5-man pre-made. Likewise, I think 2v2 should become a permanent mode, either an hourly AT or another separate game mode entirely. 2v2 was actually really fun while it lasted, and just like Team Q, it ensures fairness by design. A concept that is absolutely foreign in a mode that would restrict at least 2 people every game to play on their own. It becomes even easier to see past the "we just want to play with friends" excuse when you look at how uncommon it was prior to 1600 DuoQ becoming a thing. People seem to forget that you could actually DuoQ before if you were under 1600 rating. Only hardly anyone actually did that because they know it would fuck their matchmaking and get them paired with people far better and or worse than themselves. Which, if you go back to ArenaNet's original post on why they removed DuoQ, that was actually the main reasoning behind it. DuoQ now does not exist to help you play ranked with friends. DuoQ exists to fool you into losing with your friends, and ensuring the people responsible for most of those losses have a much easier time getting into your games and rolling across your team, 500 to 100. All these people exploiting this care about is winning as easily as possible. They aren't there to play with friends. Don't let yourself be fooled.
So, say I'm playing a firebrand and I have to support a necromancer who is, say, like gold, and I'm plat 2 up. I can't DuoQ with a platinum 2 necro that I find to be, good enough to play with. So I'm playing with a gold necro and I have to support this player. Well, whether or not he's a gold player or not, if he is not fulfilling his role, then my role is almost impossible to do, and I feel quite useless as a result. So
this argument is unique in that it probably would have been effective reasoning, but before DuoQ was added. Even then, the only classes that can really attest to this are Firebrand and Necro. This argument holds itself up on the fact that you can't be effective in a solo queue environment as a Firebrand, as a Necro, when that's simply not the case. You can still be an effective Firebrand. You can still be an effective Necro. Having someone to coordinate with doesn't really change the effectiveness of the classes themselves. All it does is ensure that you get to play them better. And that doesn't just go for these, that goes for any class. I argue that having a Scourge or a Firebrand in a team fight in solo queue is equally as helpful as having it in DuoQ. And even if you don't agree, the sort of Firebrand-Scourge combo has been falling out of play recently, as both classes have been extensively nerfed over the last few patches. This sort of works against the argument itself, and is more of an argument towards ArenaNet's terrible balancing philosophy, rather than acting as an excuse for DuoQ to exist. In my opinion, no class should ever be overly dependent on another. They should all be able to stand on their own in some sort of way. I'd even go as far as to accuse the person who made this video of trying to deflect criticism towards DuoQ by using Firebrand and Scourge, because the majority of DuoQ players will play something extra bursty with their friend, so they can both jump on a single target and instantly melt them without giving them a chance to react.
Oh, another example of that is if I play Thief and I have like 4 Necros on my team, for example. Okay, like 2 Firebrands and 2 Necros, okay? That's a better example. And the only thing Firebrands and Necros can do is really team fight and stick together. And what that does is, it means as a Thief, if I want to split and create map rotations like my class requires to get value out of, I need to either go solo, which Thief is actually one of the worst 1v1ers, or I have to hope that the enemy team doesn't rotate into where that I go. And that's just kind of relying on a bad gameplay mechanic, really. Relying on people not playing optimally. So as a Thief, you really want like roamers. As a Thief, you really want like roamers and 1v1ers and stuff like that to kind of help you to get plays done around the map rather than just team fights, because if you just stay in a team fight and it's an even match, well, it would be better off if you were just a Revenant or a Hollow, because you have more sustain as those classes and you have more damage. So really it makes it more reliable as a thief player and even as a support player to be able to queue with a roamer, or as a firebrand to queue with a DPS like a Necro or a Revenant, and to have that synergy that solo queue doesn't allow. Because right now solo queue is more about what build gives me the highest 1vx potential. How many players can I farm by myself and just create a numbers advantage for my other players and hope that they can get something done with that. It's not as interesting of a meta to have it balanced around 1v1ers, because that's how the system is created. It creates a meta that's based around 1v1ers because you can only solo queue. And the way that I said before, how matches have a high disparity in skill, if I play a support build, I can't rely on my other players to make my build effective by making others useful, because I can't rely on them being useful.
The real truth of the matter is that everyone is typically going to play the most optimal build for their preferred class. They aren't any less likely not to play their favorite class just because they aren't in a duo. If anything, DuoQ only changes their build to play to the strengths of their fellow duo. And while yes, that might change build diversity, it isn't going to change that it's still an unfair advantage over all the solo queue players who aren't going to change how they play their favorite class.
So, yeah, population kind of is one of the main reasons why DuoQ needs to come back, but also the reason that I stated before, as it allows more team play. There's a lot of different comps that you can make with a DuoQ that are really interesting.
First of all, population is one of the main reasons DuoQ should not have come back. One of the main arguments against Guild Wars 2 PvP in its solo queue form is how seemingly random and poor the matchmaker is at pitting you against people of a similar ranking. And the biggest reason behind that is that there's hardly anyone ever playing Guild Wars 2 SPvP in general, even less at any given moment of the day. So sure, a DuoQ partner might ensure that you get another top-ranked player on your team, but the matchmaker is typically going to put lower-ranked players in the other 3 slots to compensate for the harsh imbalance you're creating with your queue. In doing so, it's impossible to find a middle ground. You're either actively making the game worse for yourself, or you're rolling over the other team. The only thing that's assured is that those other 3 players on your team aren't going to have a very fun time. All this duo stacking might cause those 3 players to leave the game, and then the population only shrinks further and the cycle continues. But I guess that's okay, so long as you perceive the game to be more team-oriented, even though we both know that's bullshit. See, if you want to play the game more team-oriented, then you should be more inclined to shun DuoQ and promote Team Q. In no way does DuoQ promote team play when you have little to no jurisdiction over what those other 3 people on your team are playing. And for that reason, if you want team-oriented gameplay, you'll vote to have Team Q come back in the game rather than DuoQ. It's not really about losses, it's about poor match quality that the DuoQ creates. Being a 5v5 game mode, you're just as likely to end up on the side of a bad DuoQ, whether they're far too low and being matched with you to compensate for their stack, or they're far too high and being matched with you for the same reason. You might find yourself alone in a very uneven game. There's nothing fun or particularly worthwhile about a game that ends 500 to 100. Whether you win and lose in that scenario. The fun from Guild Wars 2 PvP comes from close, intense matches and great duels. When it comes to not having friends, not only is that a terrible argument, but even if it were the case, that might be something you ought to relate to. And I'm being as technical as possible when I say that. I'm not being an asshole. The Guild Wars 2 SPvP population is incredibly small, and PvP itself isn't very welcoming to new players. Not only because of the vast amount of toxic win trading and power stacking, but a general incompetence when it comes to balancing the game. I've shown people on my friends list on Discord Guild Wars 2 PvP. Some of them even come from the PvE side of the game. The majority of those people are immediately turned off as soon as they go up against something like Bunker Scrapper as it is right now. It's just not fun to play into for someone accustomed to competitive gaming, and there's not really anything positive I could say to defend that. So I'll admit it, I don't have any friends, at least not any willing to get into Guild Wars 2 ranked, but I think that goes for everyone, given how hard it is to get people excited about a game this dull. Really? So if I'm a top 10 player and I queue up with another top 10 player, even though that puts me above the vast majority of players by rank alone, that's still fair? What about coordination? Sure, in solo queue you can call out a target to burst, but anything important you have to say, you actually have to type that out, or you have to ping the map. And there's always the chance that your teammates might not even notice, or they might not speak English. Plenty of problems. Let's be real for a second. If you're in a duo stack, then you're going to be in a call. You're going to be coordinating via voice, and you're going to know the person on the other end. They will hear everything. They're guaranteed to follow up on their callouts and to play with the power of 2 players, whereas the other 8 might all be playing on their own, and they won't have the same luxury. That is an advantage. As I've said countless times throughout this video, DuoQ is unfair in a 5v5 game mode. There is always going to be at least 2 players who get screwed over in that environment. But don't take it from me, take it from this top whiner.
As far as the balance between who gets, the best rating per, effort put into it, it's a little bit in the favor of the people who DuoQ, right? But I think that God of PvP probably should have to DuoQ anyways, because it shows more skill to have a team play build than a solo build.
As he says, DuoQ does get an advantage over solo queue players, but their justification is awful. Of fucking course people in a duo queue are going to be more inclined to play a team-oriented build. Playing to the strength of your disposition doesn't make you any better than anyone else at the game, nor does it make you any more entitled to God of PvP. I'd argue that a solo queue player would probably be more deserving of it than any duo queue player. Given how you say they're at an inherent disadvantage, that makes me more likely to root for them rather than someone taking it the easy way. But then again, why would I bother? It's all meaningless as God of PvP goes to the person with the biggest wallet every season.
So how do you get to be the king? It ain't like that. See, the king, stay the king, alright? Everything stay who he is.
Sure, you can get 2 top players on a single team in solos. The matchmaker is terrible regardless of how you play. But at least with solos, it's just a chance. If a top player wants to queue with another top player, then it's guaranteed that they're going to be on the same team. I kind of figured that'd be obvious, as well as the negative effect that might have on match quality.
Lonely, I'm Mr. Lonely. I have nobody for my own.
The answer to your first question sort of contradicts your latter statement here. The lack of criticism towards solo queue was a clear sign that people both supported and or didn't care that the game was being restricted to a solo queue environment. By ArenaNet's own admission, when DuoQ was first restricted to 1600 and below, the decision to do so didn't come only from a lack of fairness, but also because DuoQs were so rare and difficult for the matchmaker to fit in the first place. Going by that, it's easy to determine the majority versus the minority opinion here. First of all, the minority, as usual, is the most vocal, that being the exploitative, top 100 douchebags crying a river ever since it got taken away. Let's use deductive reasoning here. The lack of criticism from the other side shows that anyone below 1600 rating was already largely indifferent. And that's not even counting those of us above 1600 rating who were satisfied with Duo being removed. What you're left with is a handful of the very top percent of players above 1600 rating that were upset. That's how I arrive at calling you the vocal minority. A bunch of whiners that represent a small percentage of what is already below 1% of the game's entire population.
I'm not crying, it's just been raining on my face.
This is one of the most common excuses that the top percent will use to justify their exploitation of DuoQ. The reality is, ranked was always and will always be a dice roll. The fault isn't with the players, but more so the matchmaker valuing time it takes to get into a match over getting into a match that's fairly even. If anything, DuoQ only makes this problem substantially worse, as I mentioned in my last video. If you have a stack of pro or garbage players paired together in a match, that's an entirely new dice roll in of itself. Whatever team the stacked pros land on are very likely to win. Whatever team the stacked garbage players land on are very likely to lose. ArenaNet has stated this themselves when removing DuoQ, that they always had trouble fitting in people of great rank disparity. Perhaps you're truly naive enough to believe the population of Guild Wars 2 ranked has risen since Season 9 until now. If you do, I can see how you might have fooled yourself into believing this, but the truth of the matter is, it's actually fallen, quite drastically so. And as Ben said back then, the matchmaker couldn't competently fit these stacks together. What makes you think that it's any better now? Actually, I completely agree with this sentiment. Sure it did. It happens every season, but there's no denying that DuoQ has made it immensely more simple to win trade. During Season 13 and part of Season 14, a DuoQ'd partner could leave a game they were losing and only incur the penalties for themselves. This means that they would leave the other partner to lose, but because they had a teammate disconnect, they would lose 0 rank. 0 rank. If you ever wondered why Season 13's ranks were so inflated, why people were so all of a sudden astronomically high compared to now or previous seasons, look no further. The same people using DuoQ now were doing this left and right until it got patched, and no punishments were given out as far as I know. That's not to say that DuoQ still can't be used to promote win trading. It is. It's not just a Season 13 issue, it's still going on today. The ease of win trading with DuoQ comes from 2 factors. One being that there's no cap on how far apart 2 ranks can queue together. If a top player wants to boost their rank higher with little risk, they can go queue with a gold or silver looking to make a quick bit of gold. Or even more commonly, one of the people in the DuoQ will just switch to an alt and boost from there. 2 being the classic way, where someone on the other team, the seller, throws the game. With the classic way, your chances of getting with your client are higher because the matchmaking is generally worse. Since you are tanking rank, the matchmaker isn't as likely to pair you with your client after dropping low enough. Since DuoQ absolutely scrambles the matchmaker, and it furthers the likelihood that you won't end up on the same team, ultimately it makes it easier than it would be in solo queue while boosting 2 players instead of just 1.
I'm not whipping cause you won't be here to hold my hand. For your information, there's an inflammation in my tear gland.
DuoQ works in games like Overwatch because that game's matchmaker is typically going to work to ensure you're matched with a duo of similar rating, whereas Guild Wars 2 is going to fit you in to play as quickly as possible, over as fairly as possible, the vast majority of the time. Overwatch also has the player population and match structure to warrant DuoQ being there. It's a 6v6 game, with more options than just DuoQ, whereas Guild Wars 2 is 5v5 with only the option to duo and solo inside of ranked. By design, DuoQing in Overwatch is far more fair than it is in Guild Wars 2. Team Q and solo queue are the only fair ways to play ranked inside Guild Wars 2 by design. Before I end this video, I want to take the time to address another silly argument I keep hearing. I couldn't find a post that's relevant, but I've heard this from some forum frequenters and players in the game. This argument is that if Team Q comes back, Solo and Team Q should not be split. I just want to take the time to say that I think this is a mistake on every level. I really hope that if Team Q comes back, this isn't the case. Team Q needs to come back, but the leaderboards, I don't really care if they get split, but the Qs definitely need to be split. Much of the problems I've gone on to mention about DuoQ would come back if the Qs, Solo and Team, were not split. Only this time they would be amplified 5 times. I don't see how anyone thinks it's fair, or how 2 separate leaderboards could exist if a full pre-made team is allowed to fight against 5 random, uncoordinated solo queue players. And I'm actually pretty sure that these are the reasons Team Q was mistakenly removed from the game in the first place. The best way to integrate Team Q now would be the most fun, competitive, and fair ways possible. That means only being able to be matched against similarly coordinated teams in both team and solo queue. To conclude this video, I want to do a sort of review, as I did in my last ranty type video, in offering some solutions on how to fix these problems plaguing ranked. To the issue of terrible balancing, like I mentioned in my last video, I think that should be dealt with by polling some changes to us, allowing us to give feedback, or maybe giving us PTR or PTS, and if that's too complicated, they could just give us patch previews like they did during this last patch. Only next time around, don't give us the preview a day before the patch goes live. Give us time to review and give feedback on the upcoming preview, and that will definitely go appreciated, I think. For a comparison or metaphor, if there was a wet floor at the ArenaNet office, would you wait to put down the caution wet floor sign until after someone already slipped and fell? Or would you put it up in time for people to step around? I sort of feel like this should be obvious, and I'll hold to saying whoever's in charge of the balance changes sucks dick. They're largely out of touch with SPvP. But I would like to amend what I said last time, when I said that they might be better off being fired. Obviously that came back to bite me in the arse, and I felt pretty bad about it for a while, but I do think these people behind the balance patches might do well listening to the community, and if not, they should probably be moved to work on other areas of the game. Not fired, but just moved elsewhere. Ranked PvP in general I think needs some tweaking, and I think that's much more urgent than any sort of balance change we could complain about. Firstly, like I say, ranked gain and loss needs to be changed to take personal performance, win, and loss streaks into account. The matchmaker definitely needs some tweaking so that people are generally being matched with players appropriate to their rank. Win traders, alt accounts, leavers, idlers all need harsher punishments to discourage what they're doing. The more heinous the offense, the worse the punishment should be. Team Q needs to come back in a queue that's separate to solo. ATs need to be made more frequent, and 2v2 ATs should become a permanent feature in-game. Personally, I think if content is released at a similar or steady pace for ranked, and we aren't waiting nearly 2 years for additional content, then I think we're finally doing alright here. But, as I say, DuoQ needs to be removed first. I cannot stress this enough. If you found yourself nodding in agreement to anything I've said about DuoQ, you'd be doing yourself and many others a service in protesting it. It was a mistake forced back into this game after having already failed once by the most elitist, hedonistic, and rank-obsessed players ranked SPvP has to offer. Fun and fair matches are what makes this game great, and there are plenty of better ways to experience those with friends without the easily exploitable DuoQ. Of any problem I've mentioned in this video, I hope we lose DuoQ first, in the coming seasons as soon as possible. I hope this video did some service to draw attention to an issue that often gets brushed aside. I'd like to personally thank the handful of people on the forums, YouTube, and even in-game that have taken to fighting this broken system, as well as you, dear viewer, for watching through in consideration. Like I mentioned last time, I don't enjoy making videos in this style, and this will definitely be my last for quite some time. because if some of these issues aren't addressed, I really don't see myself playing Guild Wars 2 much longer. I already skipped out last season primarily because of how boring DuoQ makes the matches to play into, so I am hopeful for some change there, and I'm also hopeful that maybe I've helped to sway some people against DuoQ with this video. That maybe in this 40-minute rant, I've helped swing you towards the idea that there are far more fair ways to play competitively with friends than DuoQ. Team Q especially is something I'd look forward to and encourage people who do enjoy a competitive team-oriented experience with friends to push for as well. I'm sorry if this content offended anyone, even the people directly responsible for some of the more exploitative practices I've gone on to mention. You have the means to do it, and I understand you weren't entirely to blame for that, but you also have the choice to broaden your horizons a little. Everyone likes to complain about Guild Wars 2 PvP, yet we're not really making any sort of progress in improving it. We're asking ArenaNet to regress back to a system that's already failed once. That's entirely regressive. Could DuoQ ever have a place? Maybe. Like I mentioned in my last video, if the population has time to grow, balancing and the matchmaker is improved, then it could work. But for now, remove DuoQ.